So my name is Yeshaia Blakeney. I'm the CEO of Recover Integrity Treatment Program in Los Angeles, California. I've worked in the mental health and substance abuse space for about 19 years. I'm in recovery myself. Originally, I'm from Berkeley, California, which is in Northern California in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was born and raised there. I have a mixed ethnic background. I'm Black and Jewish, which isn't so relevant, except it informed some of the ways in which I grew up in my lineages and traditions that I grew up in. I'm the youngest of three. I was a rascal when I was a little kid. I was mischievous when I was middle-aged, and I got into criminality by the time I was a teenager. And I think the behaviors were pretty much the same, but the consequences get bigger as you get older. And then got sober myself and got into recovery at 21 years old. I was court-ordered to a treatment program for 6 months. I stayed for a year. I did not go to that treatment program with intention to change my life or grow. I actually had very little insight into the problems I had at the time. But I learned while I was at the treatment program, and I was scared. And nobody likes fear, but fear can be a good motivator sometimes to be an impetus for change.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, you mentioned that it hasn't always been that you were kind of in the wellness space when you were younger. We'll say a little bit of a rascal.
Yeah.
Where do you think that stems from? Because I mean, everyone has their own story. Some people start maybe on a bit of a darker path and then go towards a lighter one. So for you, where do you think that came from?
I'm trying to think of the phrase. Alan Watts, who's one of your people, is a famous philosopher, and he brought academic Zen Buddhism to the West. One of the people. He says every human being has an element of irreducible rascality. So from his point of view, it's universal. Everybody has it. I don't know. I mean, maybe it was genetic. I mean, there were issues in my house. If you were to ask me at 5 years old, was it the issues in my house or my genetics that caused me to run across the street when my mother told me I wasn't allowed to cross the street by myself and jump on the gutter? I can't give you an answer to that question. I'm not sure. If you were to ask me, do I think it's a bad thing? I would say no. So I don't really trip on where it came from. It's a part of my personality that I still have, that I like. So I mean, I've learned to like and even learned to love most of the time.
Absolutely, and I think oftentimes some of the people that kind of help the most are the ones that were hurting the most and went through dark experiences themselves, and kind of they can reflect on that and then turn around and almost go to the complete other end of the spectrum. But yeah, okay. And talking about what you mentioned, genetics, and let's touch on this like nature versus nurture bit a little bit. So obviously of course you have your practice where if I'm not mistaken, you help those that may have some or may need some guidance, whether it's through addiction or anything else like that. Do you often, or from your perspective, do you think that a lot of the time with those patients it's more genetic in nature, or do they usually come through a specific path and that can usually be mapped out?
Yeah. So I would probably say three things, I think. One is that if you were to look at the quote unquote normative population versus people who end up in treatment, or I would say treatment, jail, prison, institutions, etc., and you were to do some testing in terms of adverse childhood experiences, i.e. trauma, you're going to find a lot higher levels of trauma in those populations. I think so. To say that there's no relationship between trauma, i.e. nurture or lack thereof, and behavior later would be silly. I do think sometimes we underestimate the power of genetics. That would be the second thing that I say. I have 4 children, and they've been raised in a different environment. I mean, I was different ages and stuff like that, but not wildly different, and they are wildly different. And so their personality structure is very different. But in terms of the acting out behaviors of getting loaded or dissociating, or the various, I would call them adaptive postures that people take, that usually has to do with trauma. That's two. Three, I think we're getting to the point where we're starting to understand that the line between nature and nurture is somewhat fictitious. I mean, as we start talking about things like epigenetics, which has to do with information being passed down from particular experiences in a lifetime, well, then nature and nurture aren't completely separate categories. So those would be my three comments to that question.
Amazing. And then, just touching back again before we move on to recover integrity and we'll call it the second half. But I just want to touch on that first half that you were speaking about before.
Yeah.
So I read somewhere that you got involved a little bit in hip hop, a bit in rap and music.
A lot of it in hip hop.
Yeah, there you go. So I suppose we could say that potentially was that would you call it your outlet? Your kind of your method of expressing yourself or dispersing energy. What was the relationship that you had with music?
Yeah, I mean, listen, from one perspective, it was an outlet, no doubt about it. And I think it's interesting. I don't think about this that much in general, but human beings in general, I would probably say men in particular, have a difficult time being vulnerable and talking about their feelings. I mean, it's interesting. On the one hand, I think there's a lot of egregious content in hip hop. I'm not saying it's bad or whatever. I think that's a complicated question, but there's a lot of foul stuff that I don't particularly want my 12-year-old to listen to, or my even though I grew up on that stuff. But there's also a lot of vulnerability in hip hop. There's people talking about losing friends, people talking about their fathers abandoning them, and that's kind of interesting or deep, because most of the time you don't sit down with your friend as a young male, at least when I was growing up in the environment I grew up in, and say, man, I'm really hurting because my dad left when I was 11 years old. You know what I mean? You don't really do that, but you can put that in a song in a way that people can hear and can connect to. And so, yeah, of course, it's an outlet. It's passion. It's an outlet. Lord knows where it comes from. We don't know what art or music is. It's just wonderful gift of life. I mean, so it's a lot of things, but part of it's an outlet. Sure.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, it's a really interesting perspective to look at it. Like you said, hip hop is maybe commercially known as violent or a little bit aggressive, but really there's a huge side of kind of vulnerability to it. And I think, it's really important for men to understand that they can be vulnerable, and that sometimes it is really helpful, but not everybody, of course, is confident enough maybe to make a rap song or some piece of music. But I think, would you say that universally, and not necessarily by actually producing music, but do you think that music has a relationship with, spirituality, well-being, we can say positivity, but perhaps as well?
I think that's clear, right? When I'll run a music group, and there are various reasons why I do that, and there's a specific way in which I do that. But one of the things I say, and this is from one perspective, which I think is true, it's not the only perspective on music. Music is a complex emotional language from one perspective. And so words, linguistics, are a little bit more two-dimensional. And so you can ask me how I'm feeling, and I say, I'm sad, right? As a therapist, how are you feeling? I'm sad. If I have enough growth to even be aware of that. But, there's such a wider range of feeling than can be captured in semantic language. And so you listen to a piece of music, and the music can cover feelings that are both, it's like, oh, this is sad and hopeful and more than I could put into words. And so for me, this idea of music as medicine is a really big deal. Like, why is it when I'm feeling sad or almost sad and I'm stuck that I have an urge to put on a piece of sad music? Which obviously people listen to sad music, which is weird because normally we think of sad music as sad. I mean, like, why would I want to do that? But something about sad music allows me to get in touch with certain emotions that I might be disconnected from because my defenses are getting in the way of me being able to connect to my authentic self and my authentic feeling. And I think that for a lot of people in treatment and obviously in the world, yeah, music is a wonderful medicine to allow us to reconnect to the feelings that we might be disconnected from or defended from, among many other things. Spiritual, yeah, like laughing, crying, music, art, religion. I mean, these are human discoveries or constructions, depending on how you think about it, that for me are some of the greatest evidence of the divine. Not that I know anything about the divine. I'm not a, I don't know. But when I go that way, when my mind or my spirit, feels connected in that way, yeah, music is one of those things, no doubt about it.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. I think there's lots of different, I suppose, channels. Really, I think maybe the thing that they all have in common is like an expression of creativity, perhaps.
That's nice. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, but okay, cool. So moving on to kind of more modern day, I suppose, with recovery integrity. Could you talk to us a little bit about what recovery integrity is? Where that's come from and what it seeks to do?
Sure. Recovery Integrity is a treatment program in a community in West Los Angeles. So it's in a building. There's actually several. There's one commercial building. That's where I'm sitting now in my office, and a couple of houses. That's the uninteresting part. The interesting part of it is the community aspect, where we're using therapeutic modality, relationships, medications, um, mindfulness, meditation, a little bit of nature, some wisdom, some care, some compassion, to create a safe environment for people to explore themselves in and to learn how to adopt, I would say, potential temporary frameworks that allow them to go from being stuck in whatever their situation is, mental health, substance abuse, trauma, whatever, to some sort of sustained, healthy living, having to do with purpose and passion, but also, more insight and awareness and feeling better and able to relate and connect with themselves and others better. So that's the interesting part of it. It's a community that comes together with that intention. We utilize, lay people and professionals on our staff, depending on their roles, to do that show up here 7 days a week. And yeah, that's what it is.
And you mentioned just there the word community. Do you find that is really an integral part of recovery integrity? Sometimes, I think it's perhaps, well, of course, there's lots of different methodologies and styles of wellness, of guidance that can be offered, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's if you're going to, let's say, see a therapist one-on-one, it's still quite segregated. But you mentioned the word community there, so how much of an impact does that play within recovery integrity?
Yeah, it's a deep and fascinating question. I would say the two elements that I would look at with recovery integrity, and if somebody's thinking about coming here or sending a loved one here, I talk to them about it, is that we're a relational community. And there are more or less intense relational communities, right? So on this side of the pond, there are certain types of programs that are called behavior modification, which sounds kind of hardcore, but what it means is that the rules are really strict and the community is being utilized for interventions. So you'll take all the clients and maybe somebody has a major issue and they'll sit and process it deeply with the clients. And there might be heavy restrictions and things like that. And so that's a really strong community, but it's also pretty intense, and so we're not to that level of intensity. We tend to do our interventions one-on-one. So if somebody's gone through something deep or relapse, we might process it, in public to a degree, but we might do some of that one-on-one. But community is a huge part of what we do, but it's not like a community, it's kind of a loose-knit, lighter community in that way that allows, if you need a little more privacy or it's a little bit much for you, that you generally can find a little bit of space. And I think that's important. There are certain conditions that people are suffering from where community can feel unsafe. And so it's important to identify, for this person, this kind of relational community will feel confusing and unsafe. too many opinions, too many people, too much emotions in the field. So they might need some places either more contained or a little more one-on-one. But for us, yeah, we're a community-oriented place. For people that's appropriate for, I would say the primary healing agent at Recover Integrity, more so than any particular therapeutic modality, although we use many, is the community and a length of stay and some wisdom. I would say those for me are primary here. I don't know if that'll always be the case, but that's been the case so far.
Okay. And so now we're going to go back a little bit to, I suppose, to before Recover Integrity. So I read somewhere that your parents were clinicians. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, they're called EdDs, which is they're doctors.
Yeah.
Of developmental psychology, but they didn't have individual clinical practices. They created nonprofit level 14, which is the highest level in California, programs for inner city teenage girls. And so they had these residential, they're mission-oriented people, and they were trying to help the most vulnerable people in our communities. So I grew up around treatment, among other things, but yeah.
And I mean, and you know, I'm not that technical, but you're not a clinician yourself, right?
I'm a KDAX. I'm a counselor.
Yeah.
I went to UCLA for my counseling degree. I actually studied to be a rabbi and have practiced being a congregational rabbi on the side, on and off, for 8 years. I'm a hip hop MC. I'm currently writing movies. I do a lot of different things. But here I'm a spiritual counselor, and I'm one of the CEOs that help support the whole shebang.
And so basically my question is, of course, you know, your guardians when you were younger, they were clinicians. Let's say they followed one route of wellness and treatment, but you maybe followed a bit of a different one. And, you know, why do you think that is? What do you think it is that spoke to you about the way that you manage kind of Recover Integrity perhaps a little bit differently?
Yeah, are you asking me? My parents approach things in a particular way, and you're
and you approach it in another way, and why is that?
Why is that?
Because, you know, I guess somebody could see that their role models may be doing something in one way and want to follow that, but you've chosen to follow slightly different.
So I guess my answer would be yes and no. My parents have had a tremendous influence on this place. They worked here. They taught me developmental psych and the developmental integrity theory, which my father founded. So there's a huge imprint of them here, which I really appreciate. What's different? Medication. They didn't use medication in the 70s, which is unbelievable. I mean, it's great. But we do use medication here, not heavy, but I find it can be a really helpful tool in a lot of circumstances. Theirs was not a recovery oriented place. I have a strong 12-step background and a strong recovery background in general. And so that just didn't exist in what they were doing. They were in primary mental health. There's also been a lot of therapeutic modalities that just didn't exist when they were practicing that exist now. In fact, almost all of them. CBT didn't exist. It was called REBT. EMDR didn't exist. Somatic work in the way that's practiced now didn't exist. Ketamine assisted therapy didn't exist. TMS didn't exist. I mean, we're in a very exciting time in treatment where all these new modalities that really work are online. So I think those are primary differences, but not as different as you might think. I mean, interesting.
Yeah. So I guess similar, but of course, you know, the space has evolved essentially, and offer new opportunities. Okay, awesome. So another thing I wanted to chat on a little bit is the idea of authenticity. I thought it was quite an interesting topic to speak about. So I'd like to ask, you know, how would you define authenticity in oneself? Yeah. And do you think that is a key factor in well-being and kind of recovery as well?
Yeah, great question. So authenticity, from my point of view, is a paradox. On the one hand, you're always being authentic because you're always being who you are. But that form of authenticity is only important in coming to accept yourself. Right? Like if I'm worried about whether I'm being authentic, well, I'm being me. I mean, I'm being me with my defenses and my mishigas and my persona and wanting to look intelligent for you. I mean, so on one hand, I'm being authentic because I'm coming in with my authentic masks and my authentic soul and all of it. So on the one hand, Don't worry about it. You're always being authentic. But that's not the authenticity that we're talking about when we're asking somebody to be authentic with us. So that's the paradox. And what I think we're talking about when we're asking somebody to be authentic is, I want to hear from your core self. There's a model called internal family systems, which works with different parts of ourself. And in that model, there's a core self that is you, that manages and works with all the parts. That's also in Gestalt, and it's also a religious idea that I have a soul, right? That there are various behaviors I might exhibit or feelings I might have, but at my core, I'm a soul, right? And so I think what we mean when we're asking somebody to be authentic, in fact, I'd say I know that's what we mean, is we're asking somebody, can you kind of cut through the bullshit and get to your soul and connect to me from the deepest place that you can, the deepest, most authentic place that you can? And that's hard to do. But I think that as we work on ourselves over long periods of time, we can relax into ourselves. And the more that we relax into ourselves, the more authentic we become.
Well, yeah, that's perfect, because that was going to be my follow-up question. I think sometimes it's really difficult to understand, even if we want to. What is my authentic self? There might be conflicting sides of you. You might be struggling to find your own identity, and I mean, that was going to be my question. Yeah.
Can I follow up with it? I mean, it's actually a very interesting question. The notion of authenticity or being real as something important is actually a new idea. People in the 1700s didn't have an idea of the authentic self. They constructed themselves from the point of view of soul and religion, et cetera, et cetera. So it's actually a new idea that has become very important to people in the West in the last 70 years or so, I would say, although in philosophy, it started a little earlier. And so it's interesting to think about what is important about authenticity. Like what color you choose to dye your hair, which is a preference, in terms of how you look. I don't really care that much about that kind of authenticity, or whether I'm wearing red or black socks, depending on my mood. And so in the end, what is the important part of authenticity that I'm looking at? Well, I'm looking at your capacity to be compassionate, to be loving, to be present with me. Do you know what I mean? To be able to express yourself in some kind of authentic emotional way. So I'm not worried about every aspect of authenticity. A lot of that stuff I think is interesting, but somewhat trivial in terms of human relationships. What I'm really concerned about is moral values, principles, connection, presence, and love. Those are the areas of authenticity. Now, for the rest of it, who cares how long my beard is, or whether I wear this hat or that? You know what I mean? And so there is what I would say is a value hierarchy in terms of authenticity, but it's specific to the moral spiritual domain, and the rest of it is just fun. I mean, it's art, it's expression, all that good stuff.
Yeah, I really like that idea. Kind of the hardest and also the most important things to be authentic with are, I suppose, the non-tangible, materialistic, superficial things that we see. Right, it's the things that we don't see where those are the things that it's important to be authentic.
And I don't want to downplay things like clothes or those things do signal to the world and give people insight about your inner life. So I'm not saying they're nothing, right? They are important. They're a part of how you present yourself in the world. Has to do with what's happening inside, one way or the other. But they're not the same as moral values, and being authentic to myself in a moment where I want to lie or tell the truth.
Okay. All right. Great. So we spoke about recovery integrity and how it helps others to grow and to recover. But a question I wanted to ask you is, have you found that you've grown from helping others to grow? And what is that relationship? Because I think sometimes a great way to kind of, what I've experienced anyway, a great way to grow is to try and help others. And they kind of have a really close connection. So how have you found that impacted you?
Working in treatment has been really good for my arrogance. It's really hard work. You have no idea what you're doing. You think you know what you're doing. You think you're, if you're present with it, it breeds a lot of humility, and humility breeds growth. It also, for me, is very grounding. I have ADHD, I have a million interests, I'd like to, do a trillion things. And so I can get kind of lost in my own, desires, which nothing wrong with most of my desires. Most of them are pretty good. But I find I sit with somebody in an important moment in their life. Actually, right prior to this, I was sitting with somebody who was just melting. And I was actually, I've known him for a long time. I'm holding him under my arm as he's crying. I'm welling up. And, you get just tremendous amounts of trauma. That and just him being able to talk about it and be with it. For me in that moment, like, what else matters? It's like, wow, man, so deep and cathartic. So yeah, I grow a lot. And what's been interesting, and I'm 41, but I've been doing this since I was 21. And it's really been this year so interesting how that could happen. And I think I was always actually relatively good at what I did. But it's really been this year that it feels like it's come together in a really deep way. And I've started to understand all the cliches and all the stuff that I was resistant to that was popular ideas that actually held truth, but that because of my own traumas and difficulties, I was resistant to in kind ways, but a little arrogant, I'm not sure about that. But if we think about it from this way, and this year, a lot of that has actually fallen, that wall has kind of fallen down. And I've been able to just be a lot more compassionate and a lot more curious and realizing there's so much I don't understand when somebody's sitting in front of me. And the more that I can understand about that person and put myself in their shoes, Gabor Mate calls it compassionate inquiry, but whatever you call it, empathy, call it what you want, that capacity to be deeply invested and curious about another's perspective, not to heal them, but just to get to know them. That has come online this year in ways that it never has for me before. And it's quite natural. It's come on in a very natural way, not in a kind of an artificial way. And that's been beautiful because it's deepened my understanding of life and myself.
And so, yeah, I mean, that sudden, I suppose, kind of like growth spurt or change that you've seen over the last
it was 20 years in the making, so I don't know how sudden it was. It took 20 years.
I mean, more the realization, the realization's been fairly. I mean, you said it was this year, right? Is that
this year, man? What a trip!
And it's come from compassion and or empathy. Now, I think some people struggle to be compassionate and to be empathetic.
Yeah.
It's not something that comes natural to everybody.
I disagree with that. I might disagree with that, but I want to make sure I understand what you say, but I possibly disagree, but keep going.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, look, I suppose just talking opinion here, but I would imagine that some people might find it hard to be empathetic.
I agree with that.
Or at least to show empathy.
Well, the reason why I stopped you is that I actually think compassion and empathy is natural. And so I think actually people have it naturally.
Yeah.
But as we get hurt in life, it can become difficult to connect to with others. But I actually think that compassion and empathy is our birthright.
Well, I mean, yeah, but much better said. So it can be difficult to show, right?
Yeah, it can.
And for those that find it difficult to show, do you have anything? Let's say somebody in recovery integrity.
Yeah.
What would you maybe suggest to them?
Yeah. So it depends on the person and the situation, their level of development, right? Because there are different ways to help raise awareness of people's internal life. But I'll speak at a relatively high level, I think you'll connect to it, and maybe some people in your audience. When somebody is having a difficult time finding compassion, it's usually because some part of them is being protective over being vulnerable. And so there's a part that's saying you can't be that vulnerable. If you allow yourself to have a soft emotion, you might get hurt. Right? So that's usually what's in the way of compassion, because logically, why should I walk around angry or frustrated or judging? That doesn't do any good. I know that in my head generally, but we have these protector parts that are actually beautiful. I mean, they come in to kind of save our butt, but some of them are younger. Some of them are a little more primitive. I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I just mean they don't see the whole picture. And some of them are old. And a lot of them grew out of our wounds. So generally, I would say 99% of the time, with maybe a little bit of exception, um, when somebody's having a hard time finding compassion in a particular situation, it's because some part of them is wounded, and the protector part comes to protect the wound, and it makes it difficult to be that open, right? So I think everybody has that capacity. Once we start to see that those are parts of the self, but that's not the core self, right? Then we're able to start to access the core self a little more. Simple exercises. Sometimes people have a lot of negativity towards themselves and their behaviors. Actually, a lot of the time, they don't have compassion for themselves. And what do I say to somebody who doesn't have compassion for themselves? Well, there's a lot of exercises. One of them is saying, hey, well, if you were your kid and you were a 5-year-old throwing the tantrum that you threw or going through whatever you went through, how would you approach that? Would you just start yelling at them? What if they were 2 years old? What if it was an infant? How would you approach that infant in distress? Would you say, you're a piece of shit, fuck you, you should be doing better, and judge them and criticize them and complain? Well, most people, if they have, done a little bit of work, are not going to give you that answer about an infant. And so it's sort of saying, well, you were an infant once. What's it like to try to, see yourself that way, as somebody who doesn't have all the answers, as somebody who is confused, as somebody who has pain, as somebody who's doing their best, and so there are a lot of exercises. That's kind of a simple one, but that's one.
Yeah. So kind of a self-awareness almost of where that's coming from, protecting the vulnerability and then addressing it at, there. Okay. And last kind of point before we close up. So I wanted to, this is a bit more spiritual now. The relationship that you have with religion. Do you think that there's been a correlation between religion and well-being, essentially?
Yeah, you asked the boogie bear in the last boogie bear, like that's a big one. I've had an evolving relationship with religion. I was an atheist at 11 years old, because who wouldn't be an atheist at 11? I try to be cautious in speaking about religion or tradition or lineages. I guess I try to have a certain bit of humility and reverence, but also be honest. And so that's a very fine line for me. So I say for me, it's like, yeah. So on the one hand, I look at the religious tradition that I was educated in. I'm Black and Jewish, so there are religious traditions that go all the way back to Africa in my lineages, as there is in everybody, because everybody goes back to Africa, right? But the religions that I was educated in primarily was Judaism. I'm a Jew, I'm a Black Jew. And that is a very wise religion. I mean, it's much older than I am, and it's been around several thousand years, and, hundreds of thousands and millions of human beings have contributed to this work of art called Judaism, this sacred work of art. So on the one hand, I try to have a little humility about that and be like, hey man, you're a more secular guy in the year 2023 that has a certain set of beliefs about how the universe came to be and and evolution and what human beings are and neurochemistry and receptors and the imaginary realm. Right? I mean, I actually have a pretty complex map as a secular person. How accurate is that map? Well, I don't know. It might be very antiquated 1,000 years from now. So I try to have a certain amount of reverence and respect. That being said, my religion and most religions emphasize the notion of truth and the notion that the divine or God, which I don't know if people will interpret that in the way that I would want them to, but is a living God. That God is not a static being. And so what God is, I can't define, because God can't be put in a box. Therefore, I feel from my point of view, I do have the right to not live within the confines of a particular scripture that was an interpretation of a particular time that might or might not apply now. So for instance, it says man shall not sleep with man pretty early on in the Old Testament. And I'm just not down with that. I mean, I understand why that might be. I might be wrong. maybe I go to heaven and God is much different than I thought God was. It says, actually, I have some really particular opinions about eating bacon and man sleeping with man. And, so I don't know. But in general, there are things in scripture that I question. But I would say there's an experience that I have in my relationship to religion, which is interesting, because I didn't grow up that religious, where I can find myself it's called shul or temple on Yom Kippur, which is the high holiday for Jews, on the ground praying, with my tallis and just shivering and crying. And that, even for me, is kind of surprising. I'm like, whoa, like, what is that? Like, I don't know that I resonate with ideas of sin and, this and that, but there's something in me, and maybe it's epigenetic. Maybe it is because religions point to deep truths. Maybe because it's a technology that's built to touch the soul. But I would be lying if I denied that religion has an influence and a power over me. And I'm constantly working out my relationship to my religion and my traditions and exploring them.
Brilliant answer. Well, thank you. I mean, that's so yeah, that's all we got time for today. But I just want to say a big thank you, Yeshaia. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Same here.
A really enjoyable conversation.
Really my privilege, and just to say to you what an awesome thing you're doing. And I bless you on your journey as you continue to grow and learn and sink into yourself in wonderful and surprising ways and cultivate meaningful relationships as we all work hard to help sustain and heal this world that we're living in. So thank you for your work, and bless you on this journey. Absolutely.
Thank you, man. Take care.
Right on, brother.